Chapter 25 Resistance and Revolutions. To start this chapter off, we're going to go ahead and underline Mendez versus Westminster. Now, normally in class, we will make reference to Supreme Court cases at the national or federal level, but I feel that this court case at the state level has tremendous value to what we're ultimately going to discuss. In Mendez versus Westminster, 1945, this is a Supreme Court case in the state of California where Hispanic students are making the argument that because they are identified or categorized as white, they should be allowed to attend white schools. Because of Plessy v. Ferguson, we saw the legalization of segregation throughout the United States as long as there was equal access to facilities or resources. Even though that may be the case, at least on paper, Hispanic students and people of color in general knew that white schools had better funding, resources. Because of that, they had better teachers, better equipment, better facilities, and they felt, well, hey, if you're going to say that racially we are white, well, then we should be allowed to attend these schools, and they're going to be supported through collective action by way of an organization known as LULAC. That stands for the League of United Latin American Citizens. This is a more concentrated version of another organization that was developed to advocate on behalf of people of color by way of legal means, and that would have been the NAACP. And don't get me wrong, the NAACP does good work. However, these Hispanics felt that a different organization was necessary. LULAC will lead them, and in their efforts, they will find success. They were able to successfully argue that they should be allowed to attend schools alongside whites. And this Supreme Court case is going to influence the governor of California at the time, whose name is Earl Warren, to say, man, you know what? If it's good enough for Orange County, it should be good enough for all of the state of California. So Earl Warren, the governor, will desegregate all public schools in California. Now, the question is, well, why is this important? Why is it significant? Why are we even discussing this at all? What we need to understand is that there are three states that, by and large, for the most part, are influencing or directing the mood of the United States of America. These three states, we can make an argument it's because of the economy, it's because of their size, but regardless of those two metrics, their influence is paramount. California happens to be one of those states. We can make an argument that it's because they tend to be a bit on the more of a liberal side of things. Texas would be the other state. They tend to be more on the conservative side of things. And then New York, because New York City tends to be an avant-garde environment. They tend to look towards the future of things, and they're marching to the beat of their own drum, but it's highly influential. Nonetheless, California desegregates all of their public schools, benefiting a multitude of young people as they strive to attend public school and have access to opportunities and resources. These Hispanic students made a great deal of that possible. But this will lead us to Brown versus the Board of Education. Let's go ahead and underline that. Brown versus the Board of Education is a federal or Supreme Court case brought forth by an organization we just mentioned, the NAACP. The lead attorney for the NAACP is a young man by the name of Thurgood Marshall, pictured here on your right. Thurgood Marshall, as a lawyer, will make an argument that the policy of separate but equal, even though it was established with the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, we have enough evidence that the application of separate but equal rarely results in equality or equity. In the Brown versus the Board of Education arguments of 1954, Marshall will combine 5 separate cases from throughout the United States making the argument that no matter where you go in this country, whether it's the North, the South, the East, or the West, we find evidence of discrimination, people of color being relegated to second-class status because of this policy of separate but equal. Marshall contends that regardless of equal funding and facilities, segregation was unequal in that it stigmatized one group as unfit, whether it be consciously or subconsciously. And through his successful argumentation, the Supreme Court will ultimately rule that maybe we should desegregate all public schools throughout the United States. Now, at the time that Thurgood Marshall is making this argument, coincidentally, the Chief Justice, the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, happens to be Earl Warren, who was the governor who had desegregated all of California public schools. So you kind of got to know where he's going to stand on this issue. Now, just because we understand that separate but equal, that policy established under Plessy v. Ferguson is problematic, and we're going to overturn that decision with this Brown versus the Board of Education decision, that does not mean that all aspects of life should be desegregated. That wasn't necessarily the argument at that point in time. The argument at the time was in relation to education, and so therefore they kept it there. What this means is that even though we are acknowledging that segregation is a problem, we're going to allow it to exist in other areas of society. And that means that individuals in our country are going to have to make extra efforts to try and stamp out those forms of discrimination because there's a fight to continue. Okay, so we're still facing discrimination regarding marriage. We're still facing discrimination in the policy of separate but equal in transportation, in housing, not housing, but or in housing communities, public parks, pools, restrooms, things of that nature. This is still a struggle that many African Americans are going to have to, or Americans in general, are going to try and combat. At this time, let's go ahead and underline Emmett Till. Now, Emmett Till is a young boy. He's 14 years old. He's from the northern part of the United States, Chicago to be exact. And while visiting family down south in Mississippi, he is going to be accused of flirting with a white woman. Now, he was out and about town with his cousins. They do interact with a white woman. However, Emmett may not be fully acclimated or aware of how the Jim Crow South operates. That yes, there are some laws that are racially discriminatory, but there are a lot of unwritten laws that many in the community just tend to know to abide by to avoid violence on behalf of racist white Americans. Because he doesn't know better, he is communicating with this woman. It does come across as flirting. And when confronted by her husband, the woman in question will probably make the argument that she was held against her will. He was threatening her. Yes, he was flirting with her. And this puts in question this young lady's honor and puts in question how much control that man has of his wife, because the reason why she probably lied to her husband was because she was scared of how he would respond to her. Now, we have to also understand that during this period of American history, not only is racism prevalent, but so is sexism, so is misogyny, so is patriarchy, implying that if a man says this, that's how it goes. And in this man's house, that's how this operates. And I could imagine the amount of fear that that young lady might have been under, but nonetheless, she makes a glaring, inaccurate, untrue statement regarding Emmett Till that is going to result in her husband and brother, the husband's brother-in-law, they're going to drive over to the house where Emmett is staying. they're going to ask to speak to Emmett. Emmett will walk out of that house without any struggle into the car of these two men. He will be found later murdered. He was beaten bloody. He was beaten to death. His body was dumped in a ravine, a river of sorts, in a body of water. By the time authorities find him, edema has probably already set in. He's no longer recognizable. The two men will be charged with murder. That gives us the impression that there will be justice for Emmett Till. However, in a predominantly all-white county, in a predominantly all-white state, with the predominantly all-white authorities by way of officers, by way of lawyers, by way of judges, by way of a jury, despite the evidence, this jury will find those two men not guilty. This will be considered a miscarriage of justice, especially when it comes to light that 2 months after they were acquitted of the crime, in an interview, the two men will boastfully admit to the fact, yeah, we did it, and what? Because they know they're white. They know that in this country they are protected from being criminally charged with a crime they've already been acquitted for. That policy of double jeopardy is to protect, unlawful accusations, unlawful court cases being leveled at individuals with little to no merit. Nonetheless, these men are operating as they feel they normally could and should, and that's the value of being white in America during this time. It was presumed you were innocent, and that maybe Emmett Till had this coming. To believe that a 14-year-old boy had murder coming his way simply because he was talking to a white woman, and then we come to find out only decades later, because on her deathbed, this woman will admit to the fact that she misspoke, she lied, and it resulted in his death. The mom decides to have an open casket for her son so that the whole world can see what the Jim Crow justice looks like for many African Americans in the South. As you can see from these graphic photos, he's hard to recognize. This young boy is 14 years old, a mother crying because that's her only son. His father, a veteran in the U.S. military, now has to grapple with the fact that in this country, when you are black, justice, even when you have the evidence, even when you are right, because you're black, there's a good chance that you're going to be found wrong. You're going to be found disrespected, mistreated, and in the case of Emmett Till, murdered, brutally murdered. And it's just evidence of racism in America at the time. Now we're gonna move on from Emmett Till, and again, I think, or we can make an argument that the significance here is that, there really is limited justice for people of color in this country, specifically the African American community, as they are experiencing a great deal of the violence leveled against them simply because they want to enjoy the freedoms of every average, ordinary American citizen. At this time, let's go ahead and underline the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, Rosa Parks will refuse to give her seat on a public bus to a white rider. Most Americans by this time are well aware of the Rosa Parks story, and that she refused to give up her seat because her feet were tired, and it sparked a movement, a civil rights movement. There's some truth to that, but it's a bit surface level. So let's dig a bit deeper. What we need to know is that this was not by accident. This was actually orchestrated by a group of women living in Montgomery, Alabama at the time who were tired of being disrespected um, in the community simply because of the color of their skin. They have constantly been asked to get off of buses, despite the fact that they showed up early. They paid for a first class ticket. If the bus oversold, they were told to get off the bus first. Well, there was a situation where a young lady refused to give up her seat um, maybe a month or two before Rosa Parks did, and it turned into a situation that escalated. It became a bit aggressive. It became aggressive, and of course, the media will report it as such. Look at black women acting as they do, because you know how they are. They're always angry black women. Now, that narrative is going to be racist, obviously, and perpetuated for the majority of the white readers who will then begin to internalize what they're reading as truth. What's unfortunate is that even if the so-called truth is inaccurate, the perspective of the African American community is always diminished, it's always disrespected, and they never really get a fair say on the issue. So these women are going to organize something and they say to themselves, man, you know what? We need to fight back. Let's go ahead and try to boycott the buses. We're not going to pay for these buses anymore if they're going to keep continue disrespecting us. Now, they also realize that, well, no, wait a minute. If we just simply boycott, that's just us three. That's not going to do much. Many people are still going to be riding these buses. And they said, okay, well, then we need to advertise our boycott to the best of our ability. Now, what would be the best thing to do to get attention to our cause? Well, people like drama. So let's figure out a way in which we can bring attention to our cause. They pick Rosa Parks to not give up her, or to get on a bus, not give up her seat, get arrested. And when she is arrested, that will draw attention to the issue. And right then and there, they can make a public announcement that they want to initiate a boycott and are requesting you join them as a sign of solidarity. So these women also realize that if they want to be successful in their movement, they're going to need numbers. They're going to need committed members. They're going to need attention by way of the media. And these women also reached out to local media outlets and said, please attend this meeting. We want you to be aware of where we stand on the issue, how we plan on addressing this issue. And then last but not least, these women also understood that in this country that has a foundation of capitalism, if you really want to bring about change, you have to have an economic impact. You got to hit them in their pockets. And so with that being said, these women, and I'm stressing this, women, because more often than not, we hear about the passivity of a Rosa Parks or the passivity of other civil rights leaders, but most of them might be men. You're going to hear about Dr. King. We're going to hear about Malcolm X. We're going to hear about Medgar Evers. But when we hear about women, it's very few and far in between. But I need you to know that Joanne Robinson, Rosa Parks, and others organized this opportunity for them to fight back and deserve and demand the recognition that they deserved. So for 381 days, the boycott will last. They are going to refuse to ride those buses. They are going to carpool. They're going to walk. They're going to bike. And I remember looking online not terribly too long ago, and I actually saw a picture of Rosa Parks next to her husband, right behind them was their car. And yes, she has a car, or yes, their family had a car, but still, that's not the point. The point is that they wanted to show others that if they work collectively and non-violently, they can bring about change. So the significance of the Montgomery bus boycott is that it showed, it demonstrated, it proved, because the Supreme Court will rule that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional in Montgomery and in Alabama. And so the boycott, the significance of this Montgomery bus boycott is that it launched the movement for justice as a non-violent crusade, that they were engaged in non-violent direct action. And I'm stressing direct action because normally when we have these discussions about equality or the civil rights movement, nonviolence will always get brought up. And it comes across as a very passive statement that if you hit one of my cheeks, I'm just going to simply turn the other cheek. Why? So you can hit me again? These individuals, yes, they were nonviolent, but they were constantly making or taking action to ensure that others were aware that they were not going to put up with this. So protesting nonviolently is important, and being direct with your action, having intention behind your action is equally important. And these women were great examples of that effort. Now, towards the end of the Montgomery bus boycott, they invite a young man by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's only 26 years old, a pastor of a Baptist church, to address a throng of protesters or a throng of individuals that were supportive of the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's right then and there the media gets a glimpse of who this young man was. And it becomes abundantly clear that this young man might be the face of this civil rights movement. So who exactly is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Let's go ahead and underline his name. And I want us to know that, of course, we hear the word Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we're going to know that he's a civil rights advocate, a civil rights leader, a civil rights icon. But let's dig a bit deeper and let's get some context to what brought him to this realization and conclusion of nonviolent direct action. Dr. King was very fortunate enough to go to school, very fortunate enough to get a bachelor's degree. He's intelligent enough to complete those educational requirements. He's going to earn his PhD and ultimately become a Baptist preacher alongside his dad at their church in Atlanta. Now, through his studies, King is going to become aware of various trains of thought as he studied in school. Of course, he's going to be reading the Greek classics. He's going to be reading about, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. But when he reads about American philosophy, he runs across the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the works of Henry David Thoreau, these transcendentalists who were also abolitionists. They believed in equality. They believed in nonviolent action. Henry David Thoreau, as a transcendentalist, is infamous for his essay he wrote on civil disobedience. And civil disobedience, according to Henry David Thoreau, argues that if you believe a law to be unjust, it is your duty to break that law. However, make sure that when you break that law, you are nonviolent. Make sure that when you break that law, that you are ready for the consequence. You need to understand that that law is put in place because your society deemed that it was necessary or essential. And so therefore, there will be consequences when you challenge that law. But understand your purpose, put your ego aside, and remain nonviolent as you strive for justice, as you strive for equality. Now, this is all done in theory, and we can make an argument that Thoreau put it into action while he was in jail during the Mexican-American War. We can see civil disobedience executed by way of Mahatma Gandhi as he tries to non-violently deliver his people from the shackles of colonialism by way of the British Empire. Gandhi will be successful in liberating the people of India to become an independent country. Unfortunately, though, for Gandhi, despite being non-violent, his life will end violently. Nonetheless, Dr. King is learning um, these stories. He's learning um, to weave and synthesize these thoughts with his own Christian upbringing, and learns that to be a proper Christian, he should probably try his very best to be Christ-like and loving, even if um, you are asked to love your enemy. Dr. King will also study the nonviolent protest of organizations like CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality, and will also learn and study the actions of A. Philip Randolph, who believes in massive demonstration to bring about change. If we're not familiar with A. Philip Randolph, he was a civil rights advocate, a labor advocate, a unionist, who was also a socialist, um, but nonetheless will lead movements or strive to lead movements that when collective action is initiated, that can also bring about change. Dr. King is going to pay attention to that tremendously. Dr. King ultimately understands that evil must meet good, hate must meet Christian love, and violence must be met with peaceful demands for change. As you can see from the picture on your right, these individuals that are walking with Dr. King come from all walks of life. They're not just simply African American, that there are whites, there are blacks, there are males, there are females, there are educated, there are uneducated, there are Christian, there are non-Christian, there are rich, there are poor, and that Dr. King had the capacity to bring all these individuals together to share a common concern. And that was equality throughout the United States, living up to the ideals of the so-called founding fathers of America. Now, the question is, how do we spread this message and bring about that change? How do we execute actions to ultimately arrive at our goals? According to Dr. King, we're going to need some form of organization. With that being said, please underline the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, this is an organization, obviously, as you can tell by the name, made up of Southerners who happen to be Christian, who happen to also be leaders. Now, who exactly might that be? Well, of course, that's going to be your Baptists, your preachers, your ministers, your pastors, the leaders of the church. They are going to attend this conference. And by the way, this conference is not just a one-time thing. There will be multiple events where they are constantly attending, they're constantly receiving training, they're constantly being educated, they're constantly practicing. But the question is, what exactly are they learning? What exactly are they practicing? They are practicing to be nonviolent and provide direct action. They are learning nonviolent direct action. It's something you have to learn. It's something you have to practice, because your natural instincts when you are probably hit is to hit back. Your natural instincts that when you are insulted might be to insult back. And therefore, we have to learn to be nonviolent. We have to learn and to put aside our ego and be humble. And for many of these individuals who identify themselves as Christians, they would just simply have to ask them, is this Christ-like? Now, why is it that only Southerners and Christians and leaders are attending this movement? Well, because from their perspective, the majority of their concerns are addressing the issues that African Americans in the South are facing, which is a Jim Crow racist South. Why do we only focus on the leaders? Well, because when you think about the leaders of the African American community, without question, you would look to the church. There aren't many African American actors and actresses. There aren't many African American politicians, scholars that the average African American or average American in general can name or acknowledge. So church leaders held an incredible amount of influence and sway over their community. So their argument was, well, let's teach these Christian leaders, and then those Christian leaders can travel back to their congregations, travel back to their people, because these conferences could most likely have been held in Atlanta or in various parts of the country. But you could have a pastor from Florida, a minister from Texas, a preacher from Tennessee. And when they travel back to those communities, they will teach their congregation the practices of nonviolent direct action. And then those people might take it upon themselves to bring about change in the same vein, in the same spirit of the Montgomery bus boycott. That if and when we bring about collective action and we are nonviolent, that can produce results that will be beneficial, not just to the Black community, but to the American experience in general. The Southern Christian Leadership is a vehicle that will share and spread that message so that more Americans can engage in nonviolent direct action.